Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video here on my channel. Today, we are going to be going over some tips in order to get your bass and lead sounds playing together in a nice way. Now, this is something that can be really difficult as you're making different sounds because these areas do actually tend to clash a lot. You might think maybe they wouldn't because, you know, your sub should be very far away from where your lead is sitting. But obviously, when I'm talking about bass, I don't mean just a sub bass. We're talking about like a full spectrum bass or a mid bass. These can often clash with your lead sounds in a way, and there are a few things you could do to fix that and make them sit nicely in a mix together. So we do have a project here which I'm going to demo this on. It already sounds pretty good, and that actually leads me to my very first point, in that when you're sound designing these two elements, you kind of want to keep this in mind from the very beginning, because if you do, you're going to have less of a problem to solve. So you might remember this project file from my previous video that I did, which was how to upgrade your lead sounds, basically talking about techniques to get a really nice lead. I would recommend you go check that out from the card as well, because that video is really helpful, and hopefully will teach you a bit about sound design, but that's besides the point. We're going to play what we have so far, and then we're going to take a look at the patches individually to see how we got here. So here's what it sounds like right now. So you could see, we have our lead and our bass. You could very clearly hear both. And we still have effects to do to kind of separate them from each other a little bit. But overall, from the sound design process, they already play nicely together, which is really important. But the first thing I want to take a look at here, we're going to open up a brand new EQ, and we're just going to take a look at this bass, which currently sounds like this. So this is what we're working with. If you take a look at it, you can see there's movement throughout this sound in the mids. It kind of spikes whenever a note hits because I have an envelope filter on that. But apart from that, it just kind of chills out and there's a bit of mid reduction. Mid reduction is a super important thing when you're combining these sort of sounds like this, because you're going to find that's where the lead will sit. If we open up a different EQ that's at the bottom of our lead here, and we play this, you see there's nothing really below here, and the lead just exists from like here on out, so it's really heavily occupying the mids and the highs. So obviously if you have a lot of mids and highs in one portion, you're going to want to make sure in that other sound, you don't want to get rid of them entirely, it would just sound weird, but you want to make sure that it's kind of controlled. You don't really want to get rid of too much, but just make sure it's pretty flat and nothing's really sticking out. There's a couple of things you could do for that as well. One, like I said, is an EQ. Another thing I really like doing is saturating, because we could actually make a band for that region. So like over here, this section, and we solo that. Now because this is a bass and it's sort of sitting back and it's just doing its job, we could afford to saturate this, get rid of some dynamics so that way it's not poking out as much, and just make it overall more flat. So we up the drive knob while we listen to it. You see, now that's a bit more crunchy, and because it's flat like that, we could afford to, you know, turn it down a bit. Everything's a little more consistent, and it's not going to be jumping around. We can do the same for the highs. Something like that. And then I think for the lows, we're going to do a bit of clean tube saturation. These are just different sounds. You get a feel for them as you do this. Just overall make this pretty flat. Probably do something like that. So now the sound is a bit more controlled. After this, there's another thing I want to do. I talked about this quite a lot on the lead sound design video, but it's a very, very important tip, so we're going to go over it again. In a lot of elements, you could afford to get rid of quite a lot of high end. When I played the lead and the bass together, you probably didn't even notice that the lead was a bit darker than you'd expect, but I actually cut a ton of highs from that. And again, it's all about context. In the mix, it really just didn't matter, and it means when I go and add drums to this if I wanted to, then the cymbals and stuff aren't going to clash. We want to do the same thing with the bass. There's a lot of high end, and oftentimes you might think, oh, this bass, you know, if I do this, it adds clarity and it sounds cool. That's something that's taught quite a bit. But genuinely, unless the sound really needs it, which this one doesn't, this one needs a reduction, you could do something like this and just get rid of that top end sizzle a bit. Like right around here. Compare it. You're basically just missing a noise layer, but honestly, I think this sounds more hi-fi and premium with everything above like 6K rolled off. it's completely fine. And that means now the lead, even though there's a reduction up there, which we could probably see, I think it's this EQ. Yeah, it's this one and also a bit of this one. Even though there's reductions to those highs, the lead now occupies that space more than the bass, and they're going to play nicer together, which is incredibly helpful. Now, your lead sound at times will also have supporting elements, maybe like a saw stack or something just to fill out the sides, give it like the chords of your track. And that as well is something you're going to want to keep in mind when you're doing mixing like this. Just like I showed you here about making sure that the frequency spaces aren't like clashing with each other, it's going to be the same thing with like a chord stack. It's going to have a lot of mids and highs, which obviously is now taken up by your lead and to a degree your bass as well. So you could afford to throw an EQ on there and just cut out a lot of it. Do it in context though, that's a very important sort of lesson that I want to talk about. If you're listening to it on its own and you're adding like EQ, things like that, you're going to be EQing it just to where you think that element should be. But if you listen to it in context with the rest of your mix, then you're actually going to be EQing it just kind of automatically based on how it fits in with those other sounds. So if you have a saw stack, one, you could afford to get rid of a ton of lows because your bass is going to be handling the sub. I like to keep mids in because they're pretty important, even low mids because it adds to that warmth of the track. But you could do like a nice little mid scoop, get rid of a bit of mid. You could roll off the highs even more than we did for the bass and the lead. It's all track dependent, of course. These aren't hard values or anything like that. But that should definitely be something that you're doing, because then it means when you add in everything else, those elements aren't going to compete with each other at all. Instead, they're just going to work and they're going to sound really good. I did briefly show saturation, but that's something that we're also doing on the lead. And again, as I say, you're going to want to check out that lead sound design video if you want to see like the process behind that. But it's the same thing. I've divided things up into different bands here, and I'm crushing them with saturation just to make everything a bit more flat. This is why compression is also really important, because if you have something that's not saturated, not compressed, everything's sort of jumping around a bit, and at times that's going to be completely desirable. But when you're mixing in the specific way I do, like for example, this would be like a loud kind of compressed dance floor drum and bass track, you want those things to be nice and flat, because that way it's easier to mix all the time. If you have something that's a little like too dynamic to say, then you're going to have it where there's like spikes in volume, certain sections are louder, and that might happen on like a micro level, like really short duration over time, but that's going to be more difficult to mix. If you can keep things consistent, whether it's through compression or saturation, then you're just going to have an easier time when it comes to this. Of course, you don't want to go and overdo it, because something that sounds over-compressed would sound pretty bad. I kind of think I got this one down. I don't think it sounds over-compressed. It just sort of works. It is very loud and compressed, but it doesn't sound like it's a problem to me. And of course, it's the same situation with the bass, and those now are very level. They're very flat, and they play together incredibly well. But I hope this has helped you out a bit with kind of understanding how I go about this. Let me know if you have any additional tips in the comments below. These are just a few that I typically use when I'm doing something like this, but be sure to share any other tips because we're always learning. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about this in the comments below, and if you have anything else to add. But that does wrap us up for this video here. Again, I hope it's helped you out. If it did, be sure to show your support on it by dropping a like. And as well, if you're new here on the channel, I'm posting a lot of production guides. You don't want to miss out on that, so be sure to subscribe to stay up to date with those. But as I say though, that does wrap up this one. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.